There are very few names in Hollywood that can create silence in a room when spoken. Pacino is one of those names, from powerful roles in unforgettable movies to his unique way of acting that holds your attention completely. Pacino became more than just an actor, he became a legend. But what many people don't know is that his path to fame wasn't easy. In fact, the beginning of his journey was filled with rejection, loneliness, and silent battles. That's where our story begins, not on the big screen but in a small neighborhood in New York City. Alfredo James Pacino was born in East Harlem in 1940 to Italian-American parents. His parents separated when he was just 2 years old. His mother took him to live in the Bronx, where they lived in a small apartment and faced many financial struggles. As a child, Pacino didn't dream of luxury or fame, he simply wanted to express himself. He found comfort in acting at a very young age. But the world wasn't ready to believe in a poor boy from the Bronx, and many doors were shut before he even had a chance to knock. He dropped out of school at 17 to pursue acting seriously, a decision that many people around him criticized. Some even thought he had ruined his life. He took small jobs to survive: janitor, busboy, mailroom worker, anything to keep going. But behind all those small jobs was a young man who never let go of his dream. That burning desire to act, to tell stories, to be seen, it lived inside him and kept pushing him forward. Pacino was rejected many times by acting schools. His looks didn't fit the Hollywood star image. He was short, had a strong New York accent, and wasn't conventionally handsome. But he had something most actors didn't: raw talent and deep emotion. After many failures, he finally got accepted into the actor's studio, where he trained under the legendary Lee Strasberg. This was a turning point, but it was still not easy. Even after getting training, he struggled to get acting roles. Casting directors still looked the other way. He would often walk home after auditions with empty pockets and a heavier heart. It wasn't until the late 1960s that things began to change. He started getting noticed in theater circles for his passionate performances. One of his earliest film roles came in The Panic in Needle Park 1971, where he played a heroin addict. His performance caught the attention of none other than Francis Ford Coppola, who was looking for someone to play Michael Corleone in The Godfather. The studio didn't want Pacino. They thought he wasn't good-looking enough and didn't have the star power. But Coppola believed in him and fought for him, and it changed movie history forever. When The Godfather was released in 1972, everything changed for Al Pacino. His performance as Michael Corleone wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, intense, and deeply powerful. Audiences were blown away by the depth he brought to the character. Suddenly, this struggling actor from the Bronx had become the face of one of the greatest films ever made. It wasn't just a big break, it was an explosion, but what made Pacino special wasn't just that one role. It was how he followed it with more unforgettable performances. Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Scarface. He kept surprising people. He wasn't afraid to play broken or complex characters. In fact, he was drawn to them. He didn't want to be a pretty hero. He wanted to show the human soul, in all its beauty and darkness. And yet, even at the height of his fame, Pacino stayed deeply private. He didn't enjoy interviews or big parties. He once said that fame scared him, and that all he really wanted was to act. That's something that many people forget when they talk about him. Behind the spotlight was a man who just loved the art of acting. The awards, the fame, the recognition, they were never the goal. So why is this story important now? Why go back to where it all began? Because before we talk about the difficult chapter he's facing today, we need to understand the road he traveled. It wasn't easy, it never was. Al Pacino is not just a movie star, he's someone who built his career with pain, patience, and passion. He didn't take shortcuts, he earned every role. And that's why what's happening in his life now feels so personal to so many people. He represents more than just a celebrity, he represents hope, the idea that no matter where you come from, no matter how many times you're rejected, you can still rise and become something great. But even legends are human. Even the strongest have their silent battles. And as we begin to look at the recent struggles in Al Pacino's life, it's important to remember the boy from the Bronx, who once walked home after failed auditions with dreams in his heart and no money in his pocket. Because maybe, just maybe, the strength he showed back then is the same strength he'll need now. Al Pacino's rise to fame is a story that inspires millions. His movies have touched people's hearts, and his acting has left an undeniable mark on Hollywood. But what many people don't see are the quiet battles he fought behind the fame. Pacino wasn't just the face of legendary films, he was also a man with personal struggles that most fans never saw. The truth is, the spotlight that made him famous also cast shadows, and these shadows were filled with emotions, relationships, and challenges that very few knew about. Behind every red carpet appearance, behind every award he received, Al Pacino was living a life that was far from perfect. He struggled with a sense of isolation. Being a famous actor often means spending long hours away from family and friends. There were times when Pacino found himself alone, even when surrounded by crowds of people. Fame didn't make his personal life any easier, in fact it often made it harder. One of the biggest challenges Al Pacino faced was balancing his professional and personal life. He loved acting, it was his passion, his escape. But sometimes his dedication to his craft would cost him. There were times when he neglected relationships with those closest to him. His love for his work often overshadowed his ability to connect with others on a deeper level. And this led to some difficult situations, especially in his romantic life. Al Pacino has been known to have a few high-profile relationships, but his love life was never easy. He had several romantic relationships, some of which ended in heartbreak. In particular, his long relationship with actress Beverly D'Angelo was one of the most publicized. The two were together for many years, and even had children together, but they eventually parted ways. It was one of the many times Pacino found himself dealing with the emotional cost of fame. It was difficult for him to open up to people, and as much as he tried to build a family and maintain personal connections, his life in the public eye made it challenging. While Pacino's movies were being celebrated around the world, his emotional struggles were often ignored. People would focus on his incredible performances, but rarely consider what he was going through behind the scenes. His emotional struggles didn't make headlines. Instead, his films did. And this is where the curiosity lies. How could a man so talented, so admired, be so conflicted in his personal life? How could he create characters who were so deep and emotional, yet struggle with his own emotions? The answer isn't simple, but it's important to understand. Al Pacino's ability to pour his soul into his acting came from his own deep emotional experiences. But the price of that emotional depth was the personal pain he had to carry. Pacino also dealt with a sense of loneliness. Despite his fame, he found it difficult to trust people. Fame has a way of isolating you, and for Pacino, it wasn't always easy to figure out who was genuine and who was just interested in his celebrity status. Over the years, he built walls around himself, becoming more private and more reserved. The idea of being constantly watched, judged, and adored by fans wasn't always something he was comfortable with. There were moments when he would rather disappear from the public eye and just live a quiet life. But being Al Pacino meant that wasn't an option. For many, Al Pacino's fame was something they admired. For him, it was often something he had to hide behind. Behind those iconic roles, there was a man who faced the same struggles as anyone else. He wasn't just a movie star, he was a person with fears, doubts, and insecurities. And these personal challenges didn't go away just because he was famous. They stayed with him like a shadow following his every move. Another aspect of Pacino's life that fans didn't know much about was his health. While he always appeared to be in good shape on screen, he struggled with his health behind the scenes. The long hours on set, the constant traveling, and the stress of being a Hollywood star took a toll on his body. The physical demands of his roles weren't always easy to handle, and at times they caused him serious exhaustion. But Pacino never let his struggles show. He kept pushing forward, always looking for the next role, the next challenge, the next movie that would push him to be better. His dedication to his craft kept him going, even when his body was telling him to slow down. There was also a constant internal struggle within Pacino. While he loved acting and everything that came with it, there were times when he questioned whether it was all worth it. The fame, the attention, the never-ending work, it all became overwhelming. At one point, he even considered leaving Hollywood behind. He asked himself if there was more to life than the constant cycle of films and awards. And while he never truly stepped away from acting, there were moments when he wondered if the life he had chosen was the right one for him. But despite the doubts, he never stopped acting. He couldn't. Acting was a part of him. It was something that came from deep within his soul, and it was what gave him purpose. Even when everything else seemed uncertain, acting was the one thing he knew he had to hold on to. The thing is, Al Pacino's struggles weren't something he shared with the world. He wasn't someone who sought sympathy. Instead, he put his heart into his roles, letting his work speak for itself. But now, as we look back at his life, we begin to understand the complexity of the man behind the fame. His journey wasn't just one of success and glory. It was also a journey filled with emotional pain, personal loss, and the constant search for meaning in a world that often seemed too demanding. And that's what makes his current struggles even more powerful. We've seen the man who could play the most intense emotional characters on screen. But now, as he faces difficulties in his personal life, we can't help but wonder, how does someone who has lived so much of his life in front of the camera cope when the camera is no longer there to capture his every move? What happens when the man who brought us so much emotional depth has to face his own emotions alone? These are the questions that make Al Pacino's story even more fascinating. Behind the fame, there is a man who has lived through it all, the highs and the lows, the applause and the silence. And now, as he enters a difficult chapter in his life, we are left to wonder, what's next for the man who gave us so much? It's one thing to watch a star rise to fame, and it's another to witness them struggle when the spotlight dims. Al Pacino has been one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood for decades. His name alone is enough to bring to mind unforgettable characters, groundbreaking performances, and legendary films. But behind that shining career, something was happening that fans never expected. Things weren't looking as bright as they once were, and this time it wasn't just about a movie role or a new project. It was something deeper, something that made everyone wonder if the man who could play the most complex characters was in reality facing a struggle he couldn't act his way out of. In recent years, signs of trouble began to show up in Al Pacino's life. It started with small things, whispers in the media, stories from people close to him, and subtle hints that things weren't as easy for him as they once had been. At first, it was easy to dismiss. After all, everyone goes through hard times, but as time went on, the signs grew harder to ignore. It was almost like watching a man who had always been in control of his emotions and his life suddenly lose his grip. One of the first noticeable signs came with his public appearances. For years, Pacino had been a regular at high-profile events, film premieres, and press tours. His presence was commanding, his charm undeniable. But lately, something seemed off. He started making fewer appearances, and when he did, he didn't seem like the same confident figure people had known for so long. His once energetic personality seemed subdued, and his performances at events started to feel less like the Pacino everyone had come to admire and more like a man simply going through the motions. People began to notice it. Fans started to ask themselves, what's really going on with Al Pacino? Is he tired of all this? The rumors started to swirl. Some whispered about his health. Others talked about personal issues, about the struggles he might have been facing behind the scenes. At first, Pacino tried to dismiss the concerns. He was always the kind of person who kept his private life private. But the signs were there, and it became clear that something wasn't right. Pacino was once known for his fiery energy and his ability to transform into the most intense characters. But slowly, that intensity seemed to fade. His recent interviews didn't have the same spark. His voice, which once carried so much power, seemed softer. He started to speak less about his personal life, choosing instead to talk about his work, as if hiding behind his past accomplishments. And while this may not have been unusual for a private person, it felt different this time. There was a sense of distance in his words, as though he was retreating from something larger, something he didn't want to confront. Then came the reports about his health. It was nothing too serious at first, just small mentions of exhaustion and stress, but those close to him knew better. Pacino had always been a perfectionist, someone who gave everything to his work, but that kind of intensity over the years took a toll on him. The constant filming, the endless traveling, and the pressures of being one of the most famous men in the world had left him physically drained. Fans who had once seen him as the larger-than-life character on screen were now beginning to see signs of the person behind the roles, and it was clear that the actor was struggling. One of the most troubling signs was his relationship with the media. Al Pacino had never been the most open person, but in his younger years, he had a certain level of comfort with the public eye. He would occasionally joke with reporters, share a piece of himself, and offer glimpses into his life. But recently, Pacino became more and more reclusive. He avoided interviews, he stayed away from press junkets, and when he did speak, his words felt scripted. It was as though he was putting up a wall, one that kept people from getting too close. And the more he retreated into himself, the more the curiosity grew. What was he hiding? What was he so desperate to keep from the world? At the same time, his work also started to reflect the changes happening in his life. Al Pacino had always chosen roles that were intense, dramatic, and emotionally charged. But over the years, the roles became fewer. The opportunities that once came flooding in seemed to dry up. There were fewer offers for leading roles in big films, and when Pacino did take on a project, it didn't seem to have the same impact as his past films. It was as if the man who once ruled Hollywood's box office had become less of a driving force, a shadow of his former self. And for someone who had built their life and identity around acting, this had to be a painful realization. People began to wonder, was Al Pacino losing his touch? Was his age catching up with him? Or was there something more to the story? The truth was, no one knew for sure. Some whispered that he was simply tired of the constant pressure. Others speculated that he was struggling with deeper personal issues. But what was clear was that Al Pacino was no longer the invincible star he once was. In the midst of all this, his personal life also seemed to be affected. Relationships that had once seemed stable began to show signs of strain. His relationships with those closest to him, including family members and loved ones, were reportedly going through rough patches. People who had worked with him for years said that he had become more distant, more withdrawn. The man who had once been the life of the party, the one who could light up any room, was no longer the same. It was hard to imagine how someone who had so much a career that most could only dream of, fame, fortune, and admiration, could be facing such internal struggles. But the signs were impossible to ignore. Al Pacino was, for the first time in his life, battling something bigger than any role he had ever played. He was facing his own personal demons, and that's a battle that no one can fight for you. It's a fight you have to face alone. The more people speculated, the more the mystery deepened. What was happening behind closed doors? What had caused this shift in Al Pacino's life? Was it simply a matter of aging, or was there something more? Was there a personal loss, a deep sorrow that had affected him in ways the public could never understand? The curiosity grew with every passing day, and with it, a sense of concern for one of Hollywood's greatest actors. And so as we look at the signs of trouble in Al Pacino's life, we're left to wonder what's really going on. What happens when the man who once commanded the screen finds himself in a battle he can't win with just his talent? What happens when the world's most famous actor has to face something far more personal than a movie script could ever capture? Al Pacino's story has always been one of perseverance. He came from humble beginnings and worked his way up to become one of Hollywood's biggest legends. He's an actor who has always given his all to every role he's taken on. But as we know, no one is invincible. Even the strongest faces moments when life feels harder than ever. For Al Pacino, that moment has arrived. It's a time when the man who was once the face of legendary films finds himself facing something much bigger than a challenging role or a new project. This time the struggle is personal, and it's not something he can simply act his way through. Over the past few years, the signs have been there. Fans, friends, and those close to him have all begun to notice the shift. Pacino, once known for his energy, his fiery passion, and his larger-than-life presence, was beginning to show signs of fatigue. His behavior became more withdrawn. He started making fewer public appearances, and when he did show up, it seemed as though he was going through the motions. Gone was the man who would light up a room with his charisma. In his place was someone who seemed lost, uncertain, and possibly even a little afraid of the future. The question everyone was asking was simple. What was happening to Al Pacino? The beginning of this tough chapter wasn't marked by a single event. It wasn't like one day he simply fell off the map. No, the changes were more gradual, more subtle. But as time went on, they became impossible to ignore. Pacino, who had once commanded the attention of millions with his intense performances and undeniable talent, was now dealing with something that was much harder to conquer than any role he had ever played. This wasn't about learning lines or perfecting a character. It was about facing personal challenges that no script could solve. And the more time passed, the more it became clear that this tough chapter was not just a passing phase. One of the most noticeable changes was his health. Pacino had always been known for his commitment to his work. He would throw himself into every role with everything he had, regardless of how physically demanding it was. But age catches up with everyone, and Pacino was no exception. The long hours on set, the constant traveling, and the stress of being one of the most famous men in the world had taken their toll. Pacino was tired, and it was starting to show. He began to miss more events. He began to cancel interviews and press junkets. The man who had once been everywhere, always giving his best, was now beginning to withdraw. Fans, worried but not entirely sure what was happening, started to wonder if this was just a natural result of getting older or if something more serious was at play. But it wasn't just his health that seemed to be faltering. His relationships were also affected. Throughout his life, Pacino had always been somewhat private when it came to his personal matters. He didn't often share details about his family or romantic relationships. But even those close to him couldn't ignore the changes. His personal life seemed to be suffering as well. He had always struggled to maintain stable relationships, with his romantic life being filled with ups and downs. And now, the people around him were starting to notice the distance. The man who had once been known for his fierce devotion to his work was now finding it harder and harder to keep his personal life in balance. People who had worked with him for years said that the passion and drive that once defined him were starting to fade. They noticed that the fire that had made Pacino so special seemed to be burning out. For someone like Al Pacino, who had spent decades building a reputation on his ability to connect with audiences through his emotional depth and powerful performances, this kind of change was startling. It wasn't just a matter of getting older. It was as if he was wrestling with something inside himself that he couldn't share with the world. The Pacino who had always been in control, always seemed to have it together, was now facing a personal battle that didn't come with a clear solution. The media of course noticed these changes. Al Pacino had always been a private person, but now the press was more focused on his every move than ever before. Every time he made a public appearance, people couldn't help but notice how different he seemed. He looked tired, worn down. His expressions seemed distant. It wasn't the same Al Pacino that fans had adored for years. And with every new report, the questions only grew louder. What was happening to him? Was this just a phase, or was this the beginning of something bigger? Was Al Pacino okay? As the rumors began to swirl, Pacino remained quiet. He didn't offer explanations. He didn't go to the press to address the concerns. That in itself made things even more mysterious. Fans who had followed his career for so long were left wondering what was really going on. Was he battling a personal crisis? Was he facing health problems that no one knew about? Was there something going on in his life that he was trying to keep hidden from the world? The tough chapter that began to unfold for Al Pacino was not something that anyone could have predicted. After all, he was a legend. He had been in the business for decades, and it seemed like nothing could ever touch him. He had faced challenges before. Difficult roles, tough critics, and personal setbacks. But this felt different. This was a fight that didn't have an obvious enemy. It was a battle that didn't come with a script, a clear path, or a happy ending. It was a struggle that was as real as anything he had ever portrayed on screen, and it was happening behind the scenes. The uncertainty surrounding Pacino's life during this time made fans more curious than ever. People who had once admired him for his strength and resilience were now questioning whether even a man as great as Al Pacino could be broken. Was this the beginning of the end for him? Would he ever find his way back? And more importantly, would he allow himself to? As these questions lingered in the air, it became clear that Al Pacino was facing the toughest chapter of his life, a chapter that didn't come with the usual fanfare or applause. There would be no movie scripts to follow, no director telling him what to do. This was a personal struggle, one that no one could help him win. And though the world waited for answers, it became obvious that this was something only Pacino could face. He was no longer just playing a role on screen. He was living through one of the most difficult times of his life, and whether or not he would emerge from it stronger than ever remained to be seen.
The life of Al Pacino has always been filled with highs and lows. He's the kind of person who has never been afraid to dive deep into his roles, giving everything he has to the characters he plays. For years he captivated audiences with his talent and intensity, making us feel every emotion his characters went through. But recently the world saw something different, a man struggling with more than just his roles. Behind the scenes, Pacino had been fighting his own battles, battling health issues, personal challenges, and the kind of deep internal struggles that no one expected from the actor who seemed to have it all. But what happens when a man who has been at the top of his game for so long finds himself at a crossroads? What happens when the one thing you've always relied on, your work, your passion, your sense of purpose, begins to feel uncertain? As Al Pacino's tough chapter unfolded, many began to wonder, is this the end of his career? Is this the end of the man who once dominated Hollywood? The questions seemed to come from all sides. People who had admired him for years were now concerned about his future.
The man who once seemed invincible was now facing challenges that didn't have clear answers. He was no longer the same man who graced every movie screen with his iconic performances. He was a person dealing with the same struggles that many of us go through, even if we don't see them on the outside. But in the midst of all the uncertainty, there was one thing that was clear: Al Pacino wasn't ready to give up just yet. Even as the tough times seemed to keep piling up, Pacino showed signs of determination. He wasn't the type of person to let adversity define him. If there's one thing people know about Al Pacino, it's that he's always been resilient. The challenges he faced in his personal life weren't going to be easy to overcome, but Pacino wasn't someone who would throw in the towel without a fight. The path forward wasn't clear, but that didn't mean he was ready to stop trying. One of the things that made Pacino's journey so captivating was his ability to find strength in the most difficult situations. We've seen him play characters who had to overcome impossible odds. From playing Michael Corleone in The Godfather, to portraying the gritty detective in Serpico, Pacino's characters often faced situations that seemed impossible to survive. But he made them real. He made us believe that no matter how dark the path, there was always a way forward. It's this same mindset that helped Pacino in his own life. Even when things seemed like they were falling apart, he always managed to find a way to keep going. As the rumors about his health, relationships, and overall well-being spread, Pacino's fans couldn't help but wonder, would he return to the big screen? Would the actor who had been so central to Hollywood's success in the past few decades find his way back to the public eye? There were so many questions, and the curiosity about his future only grew as the days went by. But what Pacino had learned over the years was that sometimes you don't need to have all the answers right away. Sometimes you just have to take things one step at a time, even when the path ahead is unclear. The reality is that Al Pacino's future wasn't going to be like it had been before. He was no longer the young man with endless energy and an unshakable drive. The world had changed, and so had he. But that didn't mean he was finished. It meant that he had entered a new phase of his life, one where he had to figure out what really mattered. For someone like Pacino, who had spent so many years focused on his work, this was a huge shift. He had to learn to balance his personal struggles with his public life. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Even with the challenges, there was still hope for a bright future. One thing that people seemed to forget about Al Pacino was his passion for storytelling. Even in the face of personal hardship, Pacino had always been drawn to the art of telling stories. That was his true love, not the fame or the accolades, but the power of a great story. And even though his career had slowed down, the desire to bring characters to life was still very much a part of him. It was this passion that would ultimately guide him forward. But what about the people in his life? His relationships, both romantic and familial, had been strained over the years. Pacino had always been a private person, and sometimes his need for privacy came at the cost of his personal connections. He had tried to build a family, but maintaining those relationships had proven difficult. It was clear that the path forward wasn't going to be just about returning to acting. It would be about healing those relationships, finding the balance between work and family, and learning to live a life outside of the public eye. Pacino had always been driven by his work, but now he needed to focus on his personal well-being and the people who cared about him. There was no blueprint for how Al Pacino should move forward. He wasn't like other actors who could just retire and disappear from the spotlight. He had given so much of himself to the world of film that stepping away wasn't an easy option. But at the same time, continuing to work at the pace he had for so long wasn't sustainable either. He had to find a new rhythm, a new way to live his life. It wasn't about quitting, it was about changing direction. As Pacino worked through his personal struggles, many fans began to show their support. They remembered the man who had given so much to cinema, and they weren't ready to let him fade away. They believed in him, just as they had always believed in the characters he portrayed. And in a way, this support became a lifeline for him. It reminded him of the impact he had made on the world. It reminded him that his story wasn't over yet. The curiosity surrounding Pacino's next steps was undeniable. People wondered if he would return to acting, if he would make a big comeback, or if he would quietly step away from the limelight. But what people didn't realize was that Al Pacino's comeback wasn't going to be a big dramatic return to the screen. It was going to be a quiet personal journey. It would be a journey of self-discovery, healing, and finding peace in a world that had always demanded so much from him. And though the details of that journey were uncertain, one thing was for sure: Al Pacino was not done yet. He would find his way forward, just as he had always done, and the world would continue to watch as he navigated this new chapter of his life. After facing so many struggles, it would have been easy for Al Pacino to walk away from the spotlight for good. The years of being in the public eye, dealing with health issues, personal challenges, and the pressure of being one of the biggest stars in Hollywood had taken their toll. Yet, despite everything that had happened, one thing became clear: Al Pacino wasn't ready to fade into the background. He wasn't done. In fact, he was on the verge of a new beginning. For many, it seemed impossible that someone who had faced so many difficulties could come back stronger. But those who knew Al Pacino, and those who had followed his career, understood something others didn't. He was a fighter. He had always fought for every role, for every opportunity, and for every chance to prove himself. It wasn't in his nature to just give up. Even though the path ahead seemed unclear, the world couldn't help but wonder if Pacino had something left to offer. Could the man who had once given us some of the most iconic performances in film history find a way to reinvent himself? Could he rise from the struggles and find peace, both in his personal life and his career? The question on everyone's mind was simple: what would Al Pacino do next? As the actor had dealt with his own health issues and personal difficulties, many believed that he might take a step back from acting altogether. After all, he had already done so much. His legacy was secure, but Al Pacino wasn't the type of person to be satisfied with just his past achievements. The fire that had once driven him to become one of Hollywood's greatest actors was still there, even if it had been dimmed by the weight of personal struggles. It was this same fire that led him to a decision many didn't see coming. Instead of retiring or disappearing, Al Pacino decided to embrace the challenges of his life and turn them into something positive. He wasn't going to let the weight of his past or the difficulties of his present keep him from pursuing his passion. Al Pacino chose to redefine what it meant to be a star. He wasn't going to let age or the setbacks in his life stop him from continuing to do what he loved most. For many people, it's hard to imagine someone like Al Pacino being unsure about his future. He had been at the top for so long, his career spanning decades of unforgettable performances. But Pacino, like all of us, had his moments of doubt. However, instead of letting doubt consume him, he chose to move forward. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving to himself that he still had something valuable to offer. And this realization marked the beginning of something new for Al Pacino. What made this new chapter so exciting was that it wasn't just about Pacino returning to acting. This was about him reconnecting with the things that mattered most. His past struggles, while difficult, had taught him lessons that could only come from experience. He had learned that fame, while powerful, was fleeting. But his love for storytelling, for bringing characters to life, was something that would stay with him forever. The challenge now was to find a way to embrace this love while balancing everything else in his life. Pacino wasn't just trying to return to the limelight. He was learning to live in a way that was healthier, more grounded, and more fulfilling. As the months went by, Al Pacino began to step back into the public eye. But this time it was different. He was no longer just a star. He was a man who had lived through hardships and come out on the other side with a new perspective on life. Fans could see the change in him. He was quieter, more reflective, and seemed at peace in a way that he hadn't before. But there was also a sense of excitement about what the future might hold. Al Pacino wasn't just going to rest on his laurels. He was going to keep going, but this time he was doing it for the right reasons. In this new chapter, the projects Pacino chose to work on reflected his growth. Instead of seeking roles that played into his usual intense, larger-than-life characters, he began to explore different kinds of roles. The characters he chose now were more about depth, wisdom, and emotional complexity. He was no longer trying to prove that he could be the toughest or the most intense. Instead, he wanted to bring stories to life that resonated with who he was now as a person. It wasn't about being the biggest star in the room anymore. It was about being the kind of actor who could use his own experiences to shape the stories he told. The curiosity surrounding Pacino's return to acting was palpable. Fans and critics alike were eager to see how this new version of Pacino would fit into Hollywood's changing landscape. Could he still capture the magic that made him one of the greatest actors of his generation? Would his new approach to acting resonate with audiences? For Pacino, it wasn't just about trying to live up to past successes. He was carving out a new path for himself, one that was more about personal growth and fulfillment than about winning awards or getting praise. But even as Pacino found his way back to acting, the biggest change was in how he approached his personal life. Throughout his career, Al Pacino had always been somewhat private, but now he seemed to have found a new sense of peace in his personal relationships. He had learned to put more focus on the people who mattered most. While Hollywood had always been his home, he began to find balance by spending more time with his loved ones. It wasn't just about fame and fortune anymore. It was about connection, love, and building meaningful relationships. One of the most intriguing aspects of Al Pacino's journey forward was the way he began to look at his legacy. For years, Pacino had been defined by his powerful characters and his legendary performances. But now it seemed as if he was more interested in leaving a different kind of legacy. It wasn't about the number of films he had done, or the recognition he had received. It was about the impact he had on people's lives, both on-screen and off. Pacino began to focus on projects that had a deeper meaning, ones that would not only entertain, but also inspire others. He wanted to be remembered not just for his acting, but for the way he lived his life. As Al Pacino continued on this new path, there was a sense of hope and possibility that hadn't been there before. He had faced the toughest chapter of his life, and while it wasn't over, he had come through it stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. The world still watched him closely, but now it wasn't just about his next big role. It was about watching a man who had been through so much finally find peace with himself. It was about watching Al Pacino take control of his future, not as a Hollywood icon, but as a person who had learned what truly mattered.